In the world of true crime, there are cases that are solved quickly, and then there are cases that demand a lifetime of patience, persistence, and heartbreak. This story is one of the latter, a mystery that stretched across more than 4 decades, haunting a quiet Massachusetts town and a family who refused to let their son be forgotten. Welcome to Beyond the Case. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button so you never miss another deep dive into the most haunting cases solved after years and sometimes generations. On a cool autumn evening in late September of the year 1969, 14-year-old and 15-year-old teenagers across Tewksbury, Massachusetts, were preparing for one of the most anticipated school events of the season, a dance at the Knights of Columbus Hall. For many students, it was an ordinary Friday night, but for one boy, John Joseph McCabe, it would become the final night of his life. At 15 years old, John was full of energy and mischief, known for his bright smile and playful personality. He was the kind of kid who could make anyone laugh, sometimes intentionally, sometimes through the simple chaos he left in his wake. His older sister Debbie still remembered the day she opened her closet only to find it packed with grasshoppers, hopping and buzzing everywhere. And his younger sister Roberta always said John's hands were never clean, covered in grease, dirt, or frog slime from whatever creature he had rescued that afternoon. John's parents, Bill and Evelyn McCabe, saw a future filled with possibility for their son. Bill, an engineer, dreamed of watching John become a leader someday. Evelyn, who worked at the local school library, remembered him as the kind of boy who still hugged his mother before he left the house, even at 15. September 26th of 1969 was supposed to be an exciting night. John showered, combed his hair carefully, and even dabbed on his father's aftershave, though he was still too young to shave himself. He had asked his parents for permission to attend the dance, and seeing his excitement, they agreed. He promised to be home before midnight. No one imagined that promise would go unfulfilled. By 11 o'clock that night, Evelyn began her usual routine, watching from the living room window for her son's return. The dance ended at 11, and John had always been responsible. She expected to see him walking up the driveway at any moment. But the minutes ticked by. 11:30 passed. Then midnight. A tightness formed in her chest, the kind that only a mother can understand. The kind that warns you something is wrong, even without evidence. Evelyn went to her car, determination overriding fear, and drove to the Knights of Columbus Hall. The building was dark, empty. There was no sign of her son. She circled nearby streets, calling his name, praying he would appear from behind a fence or around a corner, embarrassed but unharmed. But he didn't. When she finally drove to the police station in the early hours of the morning to report him missing, she met resistance common in the 1960s. Teenagers sometimes stayed out late, officers said. He might show up. But Evelyn knew better. She returned home, sat in the kitchen, and prayed until the sun rose for the kind of miracle every mother hopes for, but not all receive. The next morning, September 27th, 3 young children wandered into a vacant lot off Maple Street in the nearby town of Lowell. It was the kind of empty dirt lot kids used as shortcuts or places to play. But on this morning, a discovery waited for them that no child should ever have to witness. In the middle of the lot lay the body of a teenage boy. Bound, gagged, motionless. They screamed. Adults came running. And soon, the police arrived to survey a scene that would haunt investigators for decades. The boy's mouth was covered with tape. His eyes were taped shut. His ankles were tied together. His hands were bound separately with rope, and another rope connected his ankles to his neck. Someone had deliberately silenced him. Someone had ensured he could not escape. Someone had left him alone, in a dark lot, terrified, struggling, suffocating. Officers immediately began checking missing persons reports, and by noon, the name and identity were confirmed. John Joseph McCabe, 15 years old, missing less than 24 hours. Police officers drove to the McCabe home carefully, intending to deliver the news with compassion. They asked to speak to Bill privately, taking him down to the basement so Evelyn wouldn't hear. But mothers always hear. Through a vent in the bathroom floor, Evelyn listened, frozen, as the words drifted up from below. Tape, rope, bound, deceased. 15. Your son. Identified. She sank to the floor. Her breath left her body. And the world, the safe, small, trusting world she had known, collapsed in an instant. Bill returned upstairs, and with only a look, she knew everything. Her cries filled the house. "I never should have let him go," she repeated over and over. "I should have kept him home." Grief convinces parents that they could have rewritten fate, but fate had already been sealed by someone else. Local police, state troopers, detectives, every available team swarmed the scene. Evidence was gathered carefully. Rope, tape, clothing, a single fingerprint. But it was 1969. DNA wasn't yet a tool. Forensics couldn't answer the questions that were desperately forming. Witnesses offered fragments: a maroon 1965 Chevy Impala seen near the lot, a boy seen hitchhiking, teenagers picking him up. One name surfaced early: Michael Ferreira, 16 years old. Another soon followed: Walter Shelley, 17. Both connected to John's school, both linked by witness accounts. Police questioned them. They denied involvement. Their stories were clean, practiced, and eerily consistent. Then investigators learned that Walter Shelley indeed owned a maroon 1965 Chevy Impala, the same model spotted near the crime scene. Still, no physical evidence tied the boys to the murder. Walter failed 5 polygraph tests, but polygraphs were considered unreliable. Police pushed, but the case stalled. And slowly, painfully, it went cold. The murder of 15-year-old John Joseph McCabe sent shockwaves through Tewksbury and the surrounding areas. A community that had once prided itself on being peaceful, predictable, and tightly knit now found itself consumed with fear and disbelief. Parents kept their children closer. Doors that had once remained unlocked at night were suddenly bolted. And the McCabe family entered the long, agonizing journey of living with a loss that no parent can ever prepare for. But despite the fear that swept through the town, leads were limited, and the investigation was still in its earliest stages. For detectives, every hour that passed without a breakthrough deepened the sense of urgency and frustration. In the days following John's murder, police focused their attention on the individuals last seen with him. Witnesses had reported seeing John hitchhiking on the night of the dance and being picked up by 2 teenagers, Michael Ferreira and Nancy Williams. When investigators questioned Michael, the 16-year-old claimed he barely knew John. He admitted he had given John a ride, but insisted he had dropped him off safely at the dance and had nothing more to do with him. Nancy, the girl in the passenger seat that night, echoed his story. She said John seemed happy, excited for the dance, and perfectly fine when they left him. But it was the second part of Michael's story that raised eyebrows. He said that after dropping John off, he had met up with his friend Walter Shelley, and the two had driven to Lowell to buy beer. Walter's car, it turned out, was a maroon 1965 Chevy Impala, the same make and model a witness had reported seeing near the vacant lot where John's body was found. Detectives immediately zeroed in on Walter. They questioned him repeatedly. He denied everything. He claimed he was nowhere near John that night except in the company of Michael. Police searched his Impala from top to bottom, hoping the car might hold evidence, fibers, fingerprints, anything. They found nothing. Still, something felt off. Walter failed 5 separate polygraph tests. 5. But in 1969, polygraphs weren't admissible in court. They couldn't arrest a teenager on gut instincts alone. They needed hard physical evidence, and the case didn't have any. For the McCabe family, it was devastating. And for the investigators, it was maddening. As months passed, Michael Ferreira and Walter Shelley both enlisted in the armed forces. Their departure was seen by many as a way to escape the whispers that had begun circulating about their involvement. Once they left town, the investigation grew even more difficult. Meanwhile, detectives explored several other potential suspects, trying to rule out every possible lead. They questioned local drug dealers, teenagers from John's school, men in neighboring towns, and even a 25-year-old named Robert Molly, who struggled with mental health issues and had known both Michael and Walter. Every angle produced the same result. Nothing that tied anyone definitively to John's death. The case was gradually collapsing under the weight of uncertainty. And then, in 1974, another possibility emerged. When an abduction involving a teenage girl took place on Route 38, investigators' attention snapped back to the McCabe case. The suspect, Richard Santos, had abducted a young girl, tied her hands and feet, gagged her mouth and eyes with tape, and left her bound eerily similar to how John had been found. The similarities were alarming. Detectives hoped this might be the break they had prayed for. If Santos had committed another assault with almost identical methods, maybe he had escalated from a previous crime. For months, they investigated him, interviewed him, compared details. But there was no connection, no shared acquaintances, no evidence he had ever crossed paths with John. The lead fizzled out. Once again, the McCabe case slipped back into silence. From 1974 through the end of the millennium, the case sat dormant. It was one of those crimes that police departments revisited every few years, dusting off the files, hoping fresh eyes would spot something new. But every time they returned, they found the same problem. Witnesses grew older, memories faded, evidence sat untouched, and the truth remained buried. The McCabe family, however, refused to let the world forget John. Every year, Bill called the police station. Every year, Evelyn held on to hope. Every year, the family prayed for justice. Evelyn continued to set a place for John at the dinner table. It became both a tribute and a wound, an act of love that reminded her daily of the son she had lost. In a 2000 interview, she confessed that she had not had a full night's sleep since the day John disappeared. Bill handled his grief differently. He documented John's life, every memory, every story, creating a written record he hoped would someday be part of the case file. When justice finally arrived, he often said he could picture John becoming something great someday, a leader, a man of impact. John Joseph McCabe, my son, J., he once wrote. I was always proud of him. The couple held on to pieces of their son's life, both literal and emotional. Evelyn even kept John's childhood savings, saying, I almost put it in the casket with him. But then I thought, when I see him again, I'll give it to him. This was the level of grief they carried. This was the level of devotion they lived with. And every year, the case stayed cold. Then, in November of the year 2000, a spark appeared in the darkness. One of John's childhood friends, Jack Ward, was attending a casual cookout with people he and John had grown up with. These were acquaintances from the old neighborhood people who remembered the case, but like many, had assumed it would always remain unsolved. Among the group stood someone unexpected, Michael Ferreira. Decades had passed since that tragic night, but Michael still carried a reputation for being tied to the case. And on that day, for reasons no one would ever fully understand, he said something that would reignite an investigation that had been frozen for more than 30 years. I know who killed John McCabe, Michael blurted out. The words fell into the conversation like a stone dropped into still water. Jack Ward stared at him, stunned. Hold on, he demanded. You can't just say that and not explain. Who are you talking about? Michael replied, It was Walter. Walter Shelley did it. He went on to say that Walter had been jealous that his girlfriend at the time, a 13-year-old named Mara, had supposedly had a crush on John. According to Michael, Walter's jealousy had spiraled into violence. The claim was shocking, chilling, unexpected. And Jack didn't hesitate. He immediately drove to Bill McCabe's home and told him everything he'd heard. Bill wrote down every name, every detail, and called the police. Finally, after decades, a fresh lead had arrived. Despite the magnitude of Michael's claim, investigators initially dismissed the tip. They said the story sounded like drunken gossip. They suggested Jack might have misheard. They didn't believe the motive. They didn't act. For 3 years, Bill McCabe called repeatedly, pushing them not to ignore it. 3 years of persistence. 3 years of pleading. 3 years of refusing to let them overlook the first meaningful lead in decades. Finally, in 2003, investigators reopened the file. They went straight to Michael Ferreira's home in Salem, New Hampshire. What they heard only made things more complicated. Michael now claimed that Jack Ward had been drunk at the cookout, going around telling everyone, Shelley did it, Shelley did it, and that he, Michael, had said, "Yeah, he did," or "Yeah, probably," only to shut him up. He denied everything else. Denied mentioning jealousy. Denied involving Mara. Denied knowing anything. And without more information, investigators were stuck. For the second time, the case fell into confusion. Another dead end. Another winter of silence. Another year of grief. 4 more long years passed after Michael Ferreira's half-confession at the cookout. 4 years of waiting, wondering, hoping, and hearing nothing. But in 2007, something finally shifted. A new district attorney had taken office in Middlesex County, Jerry Leone. He had a reputation for reopening long-buried cases, especially those that had slipped through the cracks. Shortly after Leone stepped into his role, detectives from Lowell returned to him with the McCabe file, a file that was now nearly 4 decades old. They asked him to look again, not at the evidence that had not changed, but at the statements. Old interviews were re-examined, line by line. Old theories re-evaluated. Old suspects reconsidered. And then detectives noticed something strange. A detail hidden in plain sight. Something that had never appeared in any of the earlier interviews. A new name. During Michael Ferreira's 2003 interview, the one he gave 3 years after the cookout, investigators discovered that Michael had suddenly inserted a new person into his story. A name that had never been mentioned in 1969. Never mentioned in 1970. Never mentioned in 1974. Not once in 3 decades. That name was Edward Allen Brown. According to Michael, it wasn't just he and Walter Shelley out driving that night. Now, suddenly, he claimed that Edward Brown had been with them. This unexpected addition raised immediate questions. Why introduce a new person after 30-plus years? Why point to someone who was never part of the original narrative? Was Michael trying to shift blame, spread guilt, or cover something up? Investigators wanted answers. And so, they went looking for Edward Brown. In 1969, Ed Brown, was 17 years old, lived not far from the McCabe family, and moved in some of the same teenage circles. He was not known as a troublemaker. He was not among the original suspects. He had never been interviewed in any meaningful way. But by 2007, Ed Brown was no longer living in Massachusetts. He had retired from the Air Force and settled in New Hampshire. Life had moved on for him, or so it seemed. When detectives arrived at his door, Ed's demeanor was calm, almost too calm. He insisted he had no involvement. He insisted he had never been present. And most shockingly, he insisted he had never even heard of John McCabe. But that was impossible. John's murder had been front-page news. The tragedy had shaken the entire region. Families in surrounding towns were terrified. Children his age were pulled inside and warned never to walk alone. For Ed, a boy who grew up blocks from the McCabes, to claim complete ignorance was unbelievable. Detectives walked away from the interview suspicious, deeply suspicious, but without anything solid enough to break the case. Then the phone rang. Shortly after detectives left the Brown home, a woman contacted them. It was Ed Brown's wife, Carolyn. Her voice was quiet but urgent. "I think my husband is lying," she said. Detectives listened as Carolyn revealed a secret she had kept for more than 2 decades. "About 20 or 25 years ago," she said, "Ed told me he was involved in the murder of a boy. Not suspected. Not rumored. Involved." This was the moment investigators realized something had been hidden before their eyes for almost 40 years. Ed knew something. Ed had been there. And now, Ed's own wife had confirmed it. Still, there was no confession. So detectives couldn't act. The case stalled once again. But the McCabe family did not lose hope. Bill kept calling. Evelyn kept praying. They had waited nearly 40 years. They would not stop now. In the year 2011, 42 years after John's murder, a new detective was assigned to the case. Her name was Linda Kaufman. She was relentless, focused, determined, and unlike many investigators before her, she carried the McCabe family's heartbreak heavily. She understood their grief, respected their persistence, and saw their pain not as an inconvenience, but as her motivation. She became the force the case had always needed. Detective Kaufman re-examined every file, every statement, every witness, every small inconsistency that others had overlooked. Her instincts told her the truth was there, buried beneath decades of fear, lies, and silence. And one man held the key: Edward Allen Brown. Detective Kaufman traveled repeatedly to New Hampshire to speak with Ed, not once, but multiple times. Each interview was more intense than the last. Ed repeated the same claims. "I didn't know John. I wasn't there. I don't know anything." But Kaufman's persistence wore him down. Eventually, she asked for a polygraph test. Ed agreed. He failed completely. When confronted with the results, and with the knowledge that investigators now had a much clearer picture of what happened that night, something inside Ed finally cracked. He began to talk. Not all at once, not in a flood, but piece by piece. A rope here, a location there, a moment he had buried for nearly half a century, until the truth finally spilled out. Ed Brown confessed. According to Ed, on the night of the dance, that late September evening in 1969, Michael Ferreira and Walter Shelley showed up at his house unexpectedly. They told him they needed help. They didn't say why. He got into Walter's maroon Chevy Impala, the same car witnesses had described, and they drove toward the Knights of Columbus Hall. And on the way, Michael and Walter revealed what they were planning. They wanted to teach a lesson to a boy who had supposedly been messing with Walter's girlfriend, a 13-year-old named Mara. That boy was John McCabe. What Ed described next would become the backbone of the prosecution's case. He said that when they saw John hitchhiking, Michael muttered, "There he is." They pulled up beside him. Michael got out, grabbed John, forced him into the back seat. Ed remembered John trying to shield himself, his arms up, trying to avoid the blows. They drove across the Spaghettiville Bridge. They tied his wrists. They tied his ankles. They taped his mouth. They tied a rope from his ankles to his neck. And then they left him in the field. Left him alone, terrified, unable to breathe. A 15-year-old boy, abandoned to die. Ed's confession was the missing piece that investigators had spent decades searching for. On April 15th of the year 2011, indictments were finally issued. Edward Brown was charged with manslaughter. Walter Shelley was charged with first-degree murder. Michael Ferreira was charged with first-degree murder. For the first time in more than 40 years, the McCabe family could breathe. Bill McCabe broke down in tears when officers delivered the news. One detective later said, "Mr. McCabe held our feet to the fire. He never let us forget John." And finally, his persistence had paid off. But the darkest twist had yet to be revealed, because the very men now charged with John's murder had been mourners at his funeral. They stood beside his casket. They approached his grieving parents. They offered condolences, and all the while they knew exactly what had happened. For the McCabe family, the arrests in the year 2011 were not just a breakthrough. They were the first true validation they had received since the night John disappeared. For more than 4 decades, they had been told there wasn't enough evidence, that too much time had passed, that the case was unsolvable. But Bill and Evelyn refused to let the world move on without their son. Now, at last, their persistence had forced the investigation back to life. Still, the road to justice would be long, emotional, and packed with the kind of legal challenges that come with any cold case, especially one this old. When the indictments were announced, Bill's reaction said everything. The 78-year-old man who had spent more than half his life searching for answers simply broke. His shoulders shook, his breath caught. He cried openly at the kitchen table as detectives told him the words he had once feared he would never hear. "We've made arrests." Evelyn cried too, though her tears were different. They were softer, heavier. The tears of a mother who had lived through decades of grief, whispers, rumors, and endless nights replaying her son's final hours in her mind. For Evelyn, every detail of John's last moments still felt painfully fresh. For Bill, the arrests were both a relief and a reopening of a wound he had tried every day to live with. Even their surviving daughters, Debbie and Roberta, felt the case stir up old wounds. They had lived their entire lives in the shadow of the night their brother never came home. Even as adults, they still remembered the shattering sound of their mother crying on the bathroom floor. Although justice was finally in motion, the emotional scars of the case were deep, and the legal battle had only just begun. Ed Brown, the man whose confession had cracked the case open, faced a terrible choice. He could fight the charge of manslaughter, risk going to prison for years, and be cross-examined on decades-old memories. Or he could cooperate. Prosecutors offered a deal: no jail time, in exchange for testifying truthfully against Michael Ferreira and Walter Shelley. Ed accepted. His testimony would now become the backbone of both trials, a double-edged sword that the prosecution desperately needed and the defense teams would try endlessly to destroy. Ed's cooperation ignited anger in the McCabe family. To them, he had been present when their son died. He had helped restrain him. He had left him alone in that field, and now he would avoid prison entirely. But the legal reality was simple. Without Ed's testimony, the state could not prove the case. The McCabes swallowed the bitterness. They wanted justice, even if it came at a cost. Michael Ferreira's trial began in January of the year 2013 in a Middlesex County courtroom. The atmosphere was tense, emotional, and charged with more than 4 decades of unanswered questions. The prosecution team was stacked with seasoned lawyers. Tom O'Reilly, an experienced, respected prosecutor nearing the end of his career. Elisha Willis, known for her razor-sharp courtroom instincts. James Kerr, steady and relentless. Tom O'Reilly, who had heard about the McCabe family's determination for years, felt the weight of the case heavily. He knew how long Bill and Evelyn had waited. He knew how much hope they had placed in him. This wasn't just another murder trial. This was a 40-plus-year-old promise finally being honored. On January 18th, Edward Brown took the witness stand. And for the first time in the history of the case, the horrific details of John McCabe's final moments were spoken publicly in court. Ed told the jury about Michael and Walter showing up at his house, the drive toward the Knights of Columbus Hall, spotting John hitchhiking, Michael saying, "There he is," forcing John into the back seat, tying his wrists, tying his ankles, the rope that connected John's ankles to his neck, John lying on his stomach, struggling to move, struggling to breathe, Michael saying, "This will teach him to stop messing with Mara," and finally, leaving John alone, bound, gagged, unable to breathe, in the cold dirt lot in Lowell. As Ed spoke, the courtroom was silent, except for the occasional sob from the McCabe family. After 43 years, they were hearing the truth. Not rumors, not suspicions, not theories, but a first-hand account. Michael Ferreira's defense team attacked Ed's testimony relentlessly. They argued that Ed was lying to save himself. His memory could not be trusted after 40 years. His plea deal made him unreliable. The details of the story were too old to be accurate. Michael had been framed by old rumors. They even tried to argue that the original investigation was flawed and that teenage drama had turned into unfounded suspicion. Throughout the trial, Michael sat silently, often staring at the table, occasionally glancing at the McCabe family. But the prosecution pushed back with equal force. They reminded the jury, Ed knew details never made public. Ed's story lined up with physical evidence. Michael had inserted Ed's name into his own story in 2003. Michael had made incriminating statements at the cookout. Witness accounts placed a maroon Impala Walters car at the scene. Piece by piece, the narrative grew stronger. During the trial, a haunting truth emerged. Both Michael Ferreira and Walter Shelley had signed the guest book at John McCabe's funeral. They attended the wake. They stood with mourners. They offered condolences to the grieving family, while knowing exactly what had happened, while knowing the truth had been buried with John. It was a chilling revelation that sent shockwaves through the courtroom and through the McCabe family. The betrayal was unimaginable. After weeks of testimony, arguments, and emotional turmoil, the jury delivered its decision. Michael Ferreira, guilty of second-degree murder. Not first degree, not the maximum charge, but murder nonetheless. The McCabe family wept a mixture of relief and heartbreak. After more than 40 years, they had a conviction. But their fight for justice wasn't over. Because Walter Shelley, the man accused of masterminding the attack, had yet to face a jury. As the courtroom dust settled from the Ferreira verdict, the McCabe family prepared themselves for the next storm, the trial of Walter Shelley. For decades, whispers around town had pointed toward Walter as the ringleader, the jealous boyfriend, the one with the motive, the temper, and the willingness to teach someone a lesson. Now, more than 40 years later, he would finally face a jury. But this trial would be different, more emotional, more combative, more complicated. Because Walter was not just accused of being involved, he was accused of orchestrating the final moments of a 15-year-old boy's life. By the time Walter Shelley's trial date arrived in the year 2013, word had spread across Tewksbury and Lowell. Old neighbors, schoolmates, and townspeople were following the case closely. Some had lived with suspicions for years. Others refused to believe someone they once knew could be capable of such cruelty. Walter himself had spent years trying to distance his name from the rumors, moving away, building a new life, getting married, then divorced, and doing everything possible to bury the past. But the past had finally caught up with him. The courtroom filled quickly. The McCabes sat in the same seats they had occupied during the Ferreira trial, waiting for justice one more time. The prosecution team, the same trio who had secured Ferreira's conviction, knew exactly what they were walking into. They had learned from the first trial. They had strengthened their strategy. And now they had something powerful. A guilty verdict already secured against Michael Ferreira. That conviction did not legally prove Walter's guilt, of course, but it significantly strengthened the narrative. The prosecution painted Walter as the jealous teenage boyfriend, the one angered that his 13-year-old girlfriend Mara may have liked John, the one who wanted to teach him a lesson, the driver of the maroon Impala, the teenager whose temper had frightened others, the ringleader of the abduction, and once again, the star witness was Edward Brown. When Ed entered the courtroom, he looked different than he had months earlier, more subdued, more fragile, more weighed down by the decades he had carried this secret. But one thing was the same. Every eye in the courtroom was glued to him. Ed retold the story, but this time with even more detail. Some details were nearly impossible to hear, even for seasoned investigators who had lived through the darkest cases. He told the jury how Walter was the one driving the car, how Walter seemed angry from the moment he picked Ed up, how Walter directed them to the back roads in the vacant lot, how it was Walter's girlfriend, Mara, whose name fueled the tension, how Walter stood over John as the ropes were tightened, how Walter declared that this will teach him, how Walter seemed cold, unfazed, determined. For the McCabe family, reliving these moments again was excruciating. But for the prosecution, Ed's testimony was the foundation of the case. Walter Shelley's defense team was more aggressive than Ferreira's. They knew their client's life hinged on tearing apart Ed Brown's credibility. They argued relentlessly that Ed was lying to save himself. Ed's memory was contaminated by newspaper articles and rumors. Ed acted alone and blamed Walter to escape prison. Ed had changed details over time. The case was too old to trust any testimony. There was no physical evidence linking Walter to the murder. Jealousy over a 13-year-old girl was not a believable motive for such brutality. They attacked the entire investigation, claiming it was built on desperation, not facts. They hinted that detectives had pressured Ed into remembering things that never happened. At one point, the defense tried to suggest that John's death might have been an accident, a reckless teenage prank gone wrong, and that Walter had no idea what Michael and Ed were doing. But the prosecution pushed back. These ropes were not a prank. This was intentional restraint. And they reminded the jury, Ed Brown confessed before any deal existed. He confessed because the weight of the truth finally broke him. Now the question was, would the jury believe him? Midway through the trial, something emerged that stunned both the jury and the McCabe family. A witness came forward, a classmate from 1969, who testified that she remembered Walter Shelley having a reputation for violent jealousy even as a teenager. She described him as someone who became enraged if he thought another boy even looked at his girlfriend. This testimony was devastating to the defense. It gave weight to Ed's story. It gave weight to the motive. It gave the jury an emotional anchor. And it also answered a question investigators had been asking for decades. Why John? Why a 15-year-old boy with no history of conflict? Why target someone who was known for being playful, not aggressive? Because, as the witness explained, Mara was 13. She was quiet, kind, and sometimes she talked to John. Walter did not like that at all. It was enough to justify suspicion, enough to justify jealousy, enough to justify rage. During the trial, another heartbreaking revelation surfaced, something the McCabe family had never known in all their years of grief. Detectives discovered that, during the investigation in 1969, someone had found footprints around the field where John's body had been discovered. Those footprints matched the type of shoes worn by teenage boys of the era, the same kind Michael and Walter were known to wear. But because the prints were not preserved properly, a failure of the original investigation, they could not be used in court. The courtroom felt the blow. It was a reminder of how close police had come to solving the case decades earlier, and how one mistake had delayed justice for 40 years. By the time closing arguments began, the courtroom was tightly packed, far more crowded than during the Ferreira trial. Reporters filled every available seat. Former classmates leaned forward. Families of the defendants sat stone-faced. The McCabes sat quietly, holding hands. Prosecutor Tom O'Reilly delivered one of the most emotional closing arguments of his career. He spoke not just as a lawyer, but as a father, a man who understood the lifelong ache of losing a child, even though he had not lived it himself. He told the jury, "This family waited more than 4 decades for answers. They waited longer for justice than their son was alive." He reminded them John was not just a victim, he was a boy with dreams, a boy with parents who adored him, a boy who deserved to grow old. Then he looked directly at Walter Shelley and said, "And he deserved better than what you gave him." The courtroom fell silent. All that remained was the verdict. After weeks of emotional testimony, clashes between legal teams, and decades-old memories being unearthed in the courtroom, the case against Walter Shelley was finally coming to an end. The jury now carried the burden of deciding whether the boy who once roamed the streets of Tewksbury as a teenager, the boy whose temper had scared his peers, was guilty of orchestrating the abduction and death of 15-year-old John McCabe. The weight of this decision was immense. It wasn't simply about guilt or innocence. It was about closure. It was about consequence. It was about a family that had waited more than 40 years for justice. And it was about a community that had never forgotten what happened. The courtroom emptied as the jury began their deliberations. Some people sat in the hallway quietly. Others paced nervously. The McCabe family remained together, hands clasped, whispering prayers and holding on to one another for strength. The deliberations lasted hours. Then hours turned into a full day. Then another. The tension in the courthouse was unbearable. At times, Evelyn seemed to fold into herself, her hands shaking slightly. Bill, stoic but visibly exhausted, kept his eyes fixed on the courtroom doors, waiting for them to swing open with news. Finally, on the 3rd day of deliberations, court officers instructed everyone to return to the courtroom. The jury had reached a verdict. As the judge entered and the courtroom fell silent, there wasn't a single breath that didn't feel heavy. Walter Shelley stood, hands clasped in front of him, face pale. A juror stood in the front row. Her voice was steady, her expression unreadable. For the charge of murder in the 1st degree, we find the defendant guilty. A wave of emotion broke over the room. Some gasped. Some cried. Others simply closed their eyes in relief. For the McCabe family, it was the moment they had prayed for, fought for, and waited for across 4 decades. Debbie and Roberta clung to each other. Bill bowed his head, tears streaming silently. Evelyn reached for her husband's arm, trembling. Finally, justice had spoken. In Massachusetts, a 1st-degree murder conviction means an automatic life sentence without the possibility of parole. But before sentencing could be finalized, the courtroom allowed statements from the family a chance for the McCabes to speak about the boy they had lost, the pain they had endured, and the void that had never been filled. Evelyn's voice shook, as she addressed the court. John was just a boy, a good boy. He loved his family. He loved life. There isn't a day that I don't miss him. There isn't a night I don't pray for him. I never got to see him grow up. I never got to see who he would become. And those who did this to him, they walked free for so long. Too long. Bill followed, his voice firm but heavy. Our son deserved more, and we deserved answers. We are grateful to finally hear the truth, but nothing will bring John back. Nothing will give us the years we lost. The courtroom hung on every word. Moments later, the judge delivered the final decision. Walter Shelley, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison. And with that, the second and final chapter in the fight for justice began to close. Even with both Michael Ferreira and Walter Shelley convicted, one detail continued to haunt the McCabe family, something they learned during the trial that cut deeper than any legal decision. Both men had attended John's wake. Both had signed the funeral guest book. Both had offered condolences, standing only feet away from John's grieving parents, knowing what they had done, and never speaking a word. It was an act of cruelty that went far beyond the crime itself, a betrayal that left the McCabe family shaken with a sorrow that words could barely describe. Michael Ferreira. Convicted of second-degree murder, Ferreira was given a lesser sentence than Shelley, though still significant. His conviction acknowledged his involvement but recognized that the court felt he had not been the ringleader. Walter Shelley. Sentenced to life without parole. Shelley would spend the remainder of his days behind bars. Edward Brown. The most complex of the three, he had confessed. He had provided the missing details. He had been the key to unlocking the truth. But due to his plea deal, he received no jail time. For the McCabe family, this was deeply painful. They accepted it not because it was fair, but because it was necessary. They knew that if Ed hadn't confessed, the case might still be cold. Ed Brown walked free, but many believed he would carry the weight of that night for the rest of his life. With both trials completed, the murder of John McCabe was officially closed, one of the oldest cold cases ever solved in Massachusetts. Detective Linda Kaufman was praised repeatedly for her persistence, her compassion, and her refusal to give up. In many ways, she had become a member of the McCabe family, someone who carried their grief with them, fought for them, and stood beside them every step of the way. District Attorney Jerry Leone called the case a testament to perseverance, both from law enforcement and from a family who refused to let their son's memory fade. And the McCabe family, after more than 4 decades, finally had the truth. But the story was not finished. Because the aftermath, the emotional, psychological, and spiritual toll would continue long after the courtroom doors closed. By the time both trials ended and the courtroom doors closed for the final time, nearly half a century had passed since 15-year-old John Joseph McCabe left home to attend a school dance unaware that he would never return. The legal chapter was over. The guilty parties had been named, sentences had been handed down, and the McCabe family had finally received answers. But the end of a trial is never the end of a tragedy. This is where the deeper legacy of the case begins, one built on resilience, community memory, and the profound aftermath that shaped everyone touched by John's story. For most families who endure violent loss, closure is a fragile concept. Justice in the courtroom is real, yes, but grief doesn't obey verdicts. Bill and Evelyn McCabe had spent more than 40 years fighting for their son. Their lives had revolved around pushing the investigation forward, keeping detectives accountable, preserving John's memory, and refusing to let the world forget him. Every day had revolved around the same ache, the same unanswered questions, the same cold case file. Now that answers existed, a strange emotional quiet filled the space where that lifelong battle had been. Relief existed, but so did heartbreak. It was as though their lives had been structured around the pursuit of justice, and when justice finally came, it brought not joy, but exhaustion. A type of emotional weariness that arrives after decades of tension. A weariness that cannot be fully described unless lived. Evelyn once said in an interview, "We didn't want revenge. We wanted to know what happened to our son. That is all. Just the truth." With that truth came a bittersweet stillness, a new life for a family that had long lived in the shadow of loss. Tewksbury and Lowell had changed drastically over the decades. The neighborhoods were no longer filled with 1960s homespun charm, and technology had changed the way children grew up. But one thing remained the same. People still remembered the boy who never made it home. For years, the McCabe case had been a cautionary tale told quietly among parents. A reminder of a night when innocence was shattered. A reminder that even small towns can hold dark secrets. After the trials, local schools invited speakers to talk about John's case not just as a murder story, but as a lesson in community vigilance, persistence, and compassion. His story became part of local history, a reminder that justice might sleep, but it never dies if someone keeps fighting for it. Even students who had never been born during the original tragedy learned his name. Detective Linda Kaufman, the woman who would never let the case rest, carried the emotional weight of the investigation long after the verdict. Cold cases leave marks on investigators. They require patience, empathy, and the ability to listen to grief that never fades. Colleagues said Linda kept a photo of John on her desk. Not because she needed a reminder of the case, but because she wanted to remember why she did her job. The McCabe case reaffirmed her belief that no case is ever truly unsolvable. Some simply require the right moment, the right pressure, and the right voice to break decades of silence. Linda once shared, "Some cases follow you. Some cases become a part of you." John's case was one of those. While the community moved forward, the men responsible for John's death lived out very different endings. Walter Shelley, life behind bars. Walter's sentence meant he would spend the rest of his life in prison. No parole, no appeal that could undo the verdict. For him, the decades he had lived free suddenly shrank into the reality of a prison cell. He had buried the truth for more than 40 years, building a life, working jobs, moving towns. But the truth had followed him, and now it kept him company behind bars. Michael Ferreira, living with his conviction. Michael, convicted of second-degree murder, faced fewer years behind bars than Walter, but his name would forever be tied to John's death. His life, once ordinary, was now marked by guilt, anger, and public condemnation. Michael had always been described as slippery, someone who twisted stories and avoided accountability. Now, his story had a final, undeniable chapter. Edward Brown, the most complicated figure. Ed Brown, despite escaping prison time, was the most emotionally complex figure in the case. He had carried the truth for years, telling no one but his wife. He had been a witness, an accomplice. The teenager swept into something he never imagined would turn fatal. His confession cracked the case open, but it also condemned him emotionally for life. Many believed he was haunted by the past. Although he avoided jail, he did not avoid guilt. After the verdict, John's story found new life not only in court transcripts, documentaries, and news reports, but also in community memory. A case that once sat forgotten became a symbol of parental vigilance, of small-town heartbreak, of the power of persistence, of what can happen when truth is buried, and what can happen when justice finally rises. Bill and Evelyn eventually received an award from community leaders for their unwavering devotion, a rare gesture of recognition for a family's endurance in the face of unimaginable tragedy. John's death and the decades-long investigation reshaped local law enforcement. It encouraged better cold case protocols, improved evidence handling in Massachusetts, and inspired detectives to revisit cases once considered impossible to solve. The aftermath of John's case proved a vital truth. Sometimes, justice is delayed, but it does not have to be denied. Years after the trials, the McCabe family worked quietly with community members to install a small memorial, a plaque that honored John's life. It was simple, dignified, and meaningful. It stood not only as a reminder of what happened, but as a testament to who John had been, a boy with a bright spirit, a brother who loved pulling pranks, a son with a future stolen, a child whose life inspired a decades-long fight for justice. Even now, visitors occasionally stop, read the plaque, and remember the boy who never came home. In every true crime story, there are people whose roles remain difficult to define, not suspects, not perpetrators, but individuals whose presence in the narrative shaped the decisions, emotions, and tragedies that followed. In the case of John McCabe, one such person was Mara, the 13-year-old girl who, according to testimony, became the unwitting center of a deadly jealousy. Her name surfaced repeatedly throughout the investigation and the trials. Her identity remained protected, of course, but her presence hovered like a ghost over every detail of the case. Who was Mara? What was her relationship with Walter Shelley? Did she know John? Did she understand the storm brewing around her? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, did she ever know that her teenage interactions may have sparked a chain of events that ended with a young boy's death? In 1969, Mara was a shy, soft-spoken 13-year-old girl who lived in the same community as Walter and John. She attended the same school district and knew many of the same teenagers. Walter Shelley, who was 17 at the time, reportedly saw Mara as his girlfriend. Their relationship, by today's standards, would be questioned: a 17-year-old dating a 13-year-old. But in the 1960s, small-town teenage romances often blurred age boundaries. What was clear from testimony, however, was this: Walter was jealous, extremely jealous. People described him as controlling, possessive, and quick-tempered. And though Mara and John were not romantically involved, witnesses claimed she had spoken kindly to John at school, maybe even smiled at him once or twice. That was enough. To Walter, it was enough. Enough to ignite a bitterness that would eventually escalate into violence. In the immediate aftermath of John's death, Mara's name slipped quietly out of the investigation. She was never considered a suspect. She was never thought to have known what happened. Police did not pursue her aggressively. She was a child, barely a teenager. Years later, she married Walter Shelley. The two lived together for a brief time before eventually divorcing. Their relationship was described by those who knew them as strained and tumultuous. Many believed that Walter's emotional volatility continued into adulthood, something that had begun long before John's death. As the marriage dissolved, so did any connection Mara had with Walter's past. She moved on, built a life, tried to distance herself from a memory she likely didn't even realize had shaped so much of it. During the trials, prosecutors made it clear: Mara had no involvement in the crime. She was not blamed. She was not accused. The jealousy existed in Walter's mind, not in hers. When investigators attempted to question her decades later, she offered what she could remember: a handful of fragments from a time she had long tried to forget. She recalled knowing John as a friendly boy, speaking to him occasionally at school, knowing Walter had a temper, not understanding the full extent of Walter's possessiveness, having no knowledge of the crime until adulthood. She did not appear in the courtroom. Her identity remained protected. Her involvement was peripheral, yet tragically pivotal. In a way, Mara represented the innocence that stood in stark contrast to the darkness that consumed the case. John's death didn't only affect his immediate family, it sent ripples across multiple families, households, and generations of Tewksbury residents. Neighbors who remembered John as a little boy playing outside struggled with guilt. Could they have protected him? Could they have intervened when he was hitchhiking? Classmates who once walked the same school hallways now realized how close they had come to tragedy. They asked themselves if they had missed warning signs, if they could have spoken up when rumors were circulating. The families of the perpetrators faced a dark and uncomfortable truth. Their children, boys they had raised, loved, and believed in, had committed a horrifying act. Teachers who remembered John's mischief and charm found themselves heartbroken decades later. They had watched him grow up. They had no idea that one night would steal all of his tomorrows. Every cold case carries a ripple effect, but few stretch across 40 years. This one did. For the three young men who were present the night John died, the passing decades brought very different burdens. Ed Brown carried guilt. Every year that passed added weight to a truth he held tightly inside until it finally broke him. Michael Ferreira carried anger and denial. He attempted to rewrite the story. He attempted to deflect blame, but the truth, once unearthed, refused to be buried again. Walter Shelley carried the shadow of suspicion. Even before his arrest, many believed he was involved. He lived with whispers for years, whispers that became shouts when the case reopened. Some secrets destroy lives quietly. Some destroy them loudly. This one destroyed everything in its path. After the trials concluded, legal scholars, investigators, and cold case experts across the country studied the McCabe case for one primary reason. It demonstrated how cold cases can be solved even without new forensic evidence. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no murder weapon, no preserved footprints, no physical evidence tying the suspects to the scene. Yet the case was solved. How? Because of human memory, long-term guilt, consistent witness statements, a confession, and pressure from a family who refused to give up. It became a cornerstone example used in police training programs, legal seminars, cold case presentations, behavioral analysis classes. A reminder that truth, even when buried beneath 40 years, can still be recovered. When we think about cold cases, we often imagine time as the enemy. Evidence fades, witnesses forget, suspects die, memories cloud. But the McCabe case proved something else. Sometimes, time becomes the pressure that breaks the silence. Sometimes, the longer a secret is held, the heavier it becomes, until eventually, it collapses under its own weight. That collapse in the form of Ed Brown's confession changed everything. Throughout the entire ordeal, the McCabe family's perseverance became the emotional pillar of the case. Even when the police moved on, even when evidence dried up, even when years turned into decades, even when hope dimmed, Bill and Evelyn McCabe never stopped fighting. Their persistence is what kept John's case alive. Their devotion is what forced investigators to revisit the file. Their endurance is what eventually brought the truth to the surface. In many ways, the case wasn't solved by law enforcement alone. It was solved by parents who refused to let the world forget their child. For the McCabe family, justice had finally been served. But justice is not the same as healing. Healing is not a verdict. Healing is not a conviction. Healing is a long, uneven road filled with memories, grief, reflection, and a deep desire to preserve the legacy of a loved one taken too soon. The trials had given the family answers, but the answers came with pain. They were forced to relive the darkest moments of John's short life, forced to listen to testimony describing his final minutes, forced to hear the cruelty inflicted on a 15-year-old boy who had done nothing wrong. Now, after the courtroom lights dimmed and the news cameras left, the real journey began. One of the most heartbreaking details about the McCabe family's grief was something Evelyn had done for decades. Something so simple, yet so powerful. She set a place for John at the dinner table. Every day. For years. For decades. It wasn't a ritual of denial. It was a ritual of remembrance. She told reporters, "I wanted him to know he still had a place in our home and in our hearts." Even after the trials, Evelyn continued the ritual for a time. The empty seat became a symbol not just of loss, but of a love that refused to fade. Bill, her husband, once said, "When you lose a child, you don't stop being their parent. You just parent differently." This sentiment captured the heart of their grief. Their love for John did not end when he died. It only changed shape. While John's parents became the public face of the family's pursuit of justice, his sisters, Debbie and Roberta, bore their own quiet grief. Debbie, the older sister, often described the moment she heard the news as the day her childhood ended. She went from being a teenager with a carefree life to being a girl living in a house, drowning in sorrow. Roberta, just 6 years old when John died, grew up in the long shadow of the tragedy. She did not have the clear memories her sister had, but she had the aftermath. She had the years of watching her parents cry, the nights where grief seeped through the floors, and the constant reminders that her brother was gone. Even in adulthood, the pain lingered. People would ask them about their brother. Every time, the wound reopened. The trials resurfaced all the grief they had spent decades trying to navigate. But for the first time, they could speak about John in a courtroom. For the first time, they could tell the world what he meant to them. For the first time, they could say his name with the assurance that justice was listening. As time moved forward, Bill and Evelyn's bodies aged, but their mission remained strong. Even in their late 70s and early 80s, they kept John's memory alive through community talks, interviews, and small gatherings where they shared his story. Their devotion became an example of what it means to be the parent of a murdered child, a role no one chooses, but one they carried with dignity and courage. They attended victim remembrance ceremonies. They spoke to law enforcement recruits. They shared their experience with families of other missing and murdered children. Their message was always the same. Do not stop fighting. Do not stop asking questions. Do not let your child's story end. People who met them described them as gentle, humble, and profoundly broken yet incredibly strong. Their presence carried weight. Their story changed lives. The John McCabe case became a landmark cold case study across Massachusetts and beyond. Police departments from Boston to small rural towns began revisiting their unsolved cases with new eyes. The message was clear. If the McCabe case could be solved after more than 40 years, others could too. Detectives learned to re-interview old suspects, examine inconsistencies in old statements, look for sudden name changes in later interviews, reopen conversations with witnesses, rebuild timelines with modern investigative logic. The case reinforced something powerful. Sometimes, the truth comes not from science, but from perseverance. Modern cold case units still reference the McCabe investigation when training new detectives. It was not just the family and the police who made sure John was not forgotten. The community itself played a role in preserving his legacy. Teachers who taught during the 1960s continued sharing John's story with younger generations. Students who grew up hearing their parents mention John's name found themselves emotionally invested in the case even decades later. Community members wrote letters to newspapers, attended hearings, and stood by the family. When the trial ended, neighbors gathered outside the courthouse not to celebrate, but to honor John's memory. One elderly woman, who had been a young mother in 1969, said, "We all lost something when John died. We lost our sense of safety. But we gained something too. We gained a community that refused to forget." The most heartbreaking part of the McCabe case is not just how John died, but what he never got the chance to become. He was 15, a boy full of energy, humor, and curiosity. He dreamed of driving a car someday, getting his first job, going camping with his friends, maybe joining the military like many boys his age, growing up, falling in love, having a family of his own. He never got any of those years. His dreams ended the moment those ropes tightened. When people remember John, they remember his smile, his muddy hands from catching frogs, his pranks, his curiosity, and the kindness he showed his sisters. They also remember the tragedy, but they remember the boy more. Justice is not loud. Justice is quiet. Justice rarely looks like what people expect. For the McCabe family, justice was not triumph, it was relief, a gentle easing of a wound that had bled for far too long. Justice meant knowing their son did not die anonymously, knowing the truth was not lost, knowing the people responsible were held accountable, knowing their 40-year fight had meaning. Even after the verdict, Bill and Evelyn often said they did not hate the men responsible. They did not want hatred to define their lives. They wanted honesty, answers, accountability. Justice gave them that. It did not give them back their son. Nothing ever could. But it gave them peace. Although the legal battles had finally ended and justice had taken its place in the courtroom, the reverberations of John McCabe's case continued far beyond those walls. Justice may close a chapter, but truth echoes through time. And in the McCabe story, those echoes touched 3 entire generations. To understand the full impact of the case, we must move deeper into the lives shaped by it, the investigators, the jurors, the neighbors who lived through 1969, the new generation who learned the story through documentaries, and even strangers who felt connected to John's life decades later. In most trials, jurors walk into the courtroom as strangers to the victim and the defendant. But in the McCabe case, a case rooted in a tight-knit community, many jurors had grown up hearing whispers about the murder. Some had been children themselves when John died. Some had played on the same streets where he once rode his bike. Some had gone to school with the suspects. Others had parents who remembered the fear of that autumn in 1969. Although jurors are instructed to judge only the evidence presented, the emotional weight of this case was unavoidable. One juror later commented anonymously, "Is greater than, it didn't feel like we were deciding the fate of strangers. It felt like we were giving a voice to a 15-year-old boy who never got the chance to speak for himself." They carried that responsibility heavily. When the verdicts were announced first for Michael Ferreira, then for Walter Shelley, many jurors cried quietly. Their tears reflected relief, but also sorrow. Sorrow for John, sorrow for a life stolen, sorrow that justice had come so late, and sorrow that they had to hear the gruesome details of a boy's final moments, something that stayed with them long after the trial was over. For the residents of Tewksbury and Lowell who lived through the late 1960s, John's murder became a defining memory. Some recalled being warned as children, "Don't hitchhike. Remember what happened to that boy." Parents whispered about it late at night, unwilling to frighten their children, but too unnerved to ignore the danger. Strangers locked their doors for the first time in years. Teenagers who once roamed freely after dark found themselves suddenly restricted. A tragedy that affected one family had shaken an entire town. Even as decades passed, neighbors kept the story alive. Many said the name John McCabe, with a mix of sadness and familiarity, as if referring to someone they personally knew, even if they hadn't. One elderly neighbor later said, "Is greater than." You don't forget a child taken like that. Even when life moves on, there's a part of you that remembers that boy forever. Parents across the community described a deep, lingering fear that John's story created. The 1960s were a time when children played outside until nightfall, walked miles to school, and hitchhiked without thinking twice. John's death shattered that innocence. It was a wake-up call. It forced parents to confront a harsh truth. Monsters do not always come from outside a community. Sometimes they are the boys from down the street. Sometimes they are the teenagers you once trusted. Sometimes they are the ones who sign funeral guest books and shake your hand while hiding unimaginable secrets. For many parents, this realization changed the way they raised their children not just in 1969, but for years afterward. As the McCabe case moved into the 21st century and became one of the oldest cold cases ever successfully prosecuted in Massachusetts, it gained the attention of criminologists, forensic experts, and law students across the country. The case was now studied in universities as a rare example of a confession decades later breaking a cold case, a multi-suspect teenage crime that evolved into adult legal accountability, how jealousy and adolescent impulsivity can escalate into tragedy, the weaknesses in 1960s, investigative procedures, and the power of persistence in seeking justice. Professors emphasize the importance of revisiting old interviews, comparing timelines across decades, noticing new names that suddenly appear in later statements, understanding how guilt wears down accomplices, and listening to families because they often know more than the evidence shows. The case became a blueprint for cold case work nationwide. New detectives entering the field in the 2000s often heard the McCabe case referenced in training programs as a vital lesson. Never underestimate the power of time, and never underestimate the power of guilt. For Detective Linda Kaufman, who eventually cracked the case, John's story became part of her professional identity, the case she carried in her heart, the case she refused to let go cold, the case that reminded her that behind every file is a human being who deserves justice. Other detectives who trained under her said she would often repeat a single sentence when teaching new recruits: "Is greater than always ask one more question. Never stop at the first answer." It was this philosophy that brought clarity to John's case because Ed Brown finally broke only after persistent, careful human questioning. As documentaries, news segments, and true crime channels, like Beyond the Case, began covering the story, something unexpected happened. People who had never met John felt emotionally connected to him. Viewers wrote comments and letters. "I can't stop thinking about him. I wish someone had protected that boy. He deserved to grow up. This case broke my heart." Some visited Massachusetts to pay respects. Some sent support letters to the McCabe family. Some sent donations to child safety organizations in honor of John's memory. The story reached far beyond the community where it happened. It became global. It became living history. Although the McCabe case did not directly change any laws, it indirectly influenced how cold cases were viewed and prioritized in Massachusetts. Police departments expanded their cold case units. Retired detectives were occasionally brought back for consulting roles. Grants were requested to support evidence preservation. The message traveled loud and clear. Cold cases matter. Cold cases deserve attention. Cold cases can be solved even without DNA. The McCabe family, though they never sought public attention, became symbols of what determination can accomplish. Among the 3 men implicated in John's death, the most complicated psychological journey belonged to Ed Brown, the only one who confessed. Ed walked free. But freedom does not erase guilt. People close to him said, he aged faster after the confession. He struggled with sleep. He rarely spoke about the past. He lived quietly and avoided attention. One neighbor said, "Is greater than." He looked like a man who finally told the truth, but was crushed under the weight of it. Ed's wife, Carolyn, the one who called police and exposed his decades-old secret, later said she believed her husband needed to confess, that the truth had been eating at him for years. She was right. Guilt is powerful. It corrodes. It grows. It eventually demands escape. Ed's confession did not free him, it simply shifted the burden. When people reflect on John's case, one of the most striking realizations is this: John remains frozen in time, forever 15, forever young, forever a boy preparing for a school dance. Meanwhile, the boys who killed him grew into men, lived full lives, married, worked, traveled, started families, and aged. John never got any of those years. That contrast haunts many who learn the story. It is the clearest picture of injustice. A child's future stolen, while his killers lived out theirs, until the truth finally caught up. The story of John Joseph McCabe begins with a 15-year-old boy preparing for a school dance on a cool September night in 1969. What followed was a tragedy that stretched across more than 40 years. A case that moved through whispers, secrets, dead ends, and decades of silence. Yet in the end, truth rose to the surface. Not because new evidence appeared, not because science solved what the past had erased, but because a family refused to forget their son. The McCabe case is more than a murder story. It is a testament to persistence, love, and justice, delayed but not denied. Bill and Evelyn McCabe spent most of their adult lives living inside a tragedy that seemed impossible to escape. Their days were filled with slow-moving grief, unanswered questions, and a longing that never disappeared. But they carried something far more powerful than sorrow: determination. They called detectives every year, pressed for progress every season, held on to hope through every setback. They refused to let John become just another cold case file collecting dust. And because of that iron-willed persistence, the truth, buried under decades of silence, eventually cracked open. Their efforts forced investigators to revisit old interviews. Their love forced detectives to notice inconsistencies others had overlooked. Their grief forced the justice system to keep reaching, keep searching, keep pushing. The McCabes did not just wait for justice. They pursued it. They demanded it. They lived for it. And in the end, they received it. When Ed Brown confessed in the year 2011, the weight of 42 years collapsed in a single moment. His words brought clarity to the night that had haunted the McCabe family since 1969. He described the abduction, the ropes, the fear in John's eyes, the jealousy that fueled the attack, the callous decision to leave a boy helpless in adjacent lot, the final moments of a life cut tragically short. His confession revealed a horrifying truth. John did not die instantly. He fought. He struggled. He tried to breathe against ropes that grew tighter with every movement. He died alone, terrified, and only feet from a road where passing cars never saw him. The cruelty of that moment would live with the McCabe family forever. But Ed's confession also brought something else: answers. After 40 years, they finally knew. The conviction of Michael Ferreira and the life sentence of Walter Shelley marked the end of a battle that lasted longer than many lives. The courtroom saw tears. The jury saw truth. The community saw closure. And the McCabe family saw justice. They walked out of the courthouse that final day, knowing their son's story had reached its rightful conclusion, not with unanswered questions, but with accountability. And that mattered more than anything. John's story is a reminder that safety can be fragile, innocence can be shattered, and evil can hide behind familiar faces. But it also reminds us of something far more important. Truth survives, even when silence tries to bury it. Even when decades pass. Even when hope fades. Truth endures. John's life, though short, sparked a chain of events that changed investigative procedures, inspired cold case units nationwide, and proved that no matter how much time passes, justice can still be found. His name became a symbol not of tragedy alone, but of perseverance. A reminder that every victim deserves a voice. Every family deserves answers. Every cold case deserves a second look. And every truth deserves to come out. Today, John is remembered not for the way he died, but for the way he lived. A boy who loved pranks. A boy who smiled constantly. A boy who hugged his mother before leaving the house. A boy who adored his sisters. A boy full of dreams he never got to live. His legacy is one of light, not darkness. And because his family never let go of him, the world didn't either. As we conclude this story, we honor John's memory and the brutal yet inspiring journey his family endured. Their strength brought justice. Their persistence brought truth. Their love kept John alive in the hearts of thousands. If you've made it to the end of this emotional journey, we ask one thing. Honor John by remembering him. Honor his parents by never giving up. Honor every victim by speaking their name. And if you value deep, long-form true crime documentaries told with respect, care, and accuracy, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Your support helps bring more stories like this to light. From Beyond the Case, thank you for watching.